The morning sun peeked through the blinds as Marissa Johnson's alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m. She rolled over with a groan, silencing the persistent beeping before taking a deep breath. Another day, another shift at Bellamy's. At 35 years old, Marissa had been working at this upscale Charlotte restaurant for 7 years. 7 years of memorizing specials, balancing trays of expensive food, and putting on a smile even when customers treated her like she was invisible. But today was different, though no one at the restaurant knew it yet. Marissa's small apartment was neat and organized, much like her life. On her dresser sat framed photos of her graduation day, an MBA in hospitality management that had taken her 6 years of night classes to earn. Next to it was a picture of her late grandmother, who had always told her, "Baby girl, you're going to own something special one day." As she got ready for work, Marissa checked her phone. There was a message from her lawyer. "All paperwork filed. Congratulations, Ms. Johnson. You are officially the new owner of Bellamy's restaurant." A smile spread across her face. After years of saving every penny, after countless meetings with banks and investors, after all the nights spent creating business plans instead of sleeping, she had done it. She had purchased the restaurant from Mr. Bellamy, who was retiring after 30 years. But Marissa had decided to keep this news quiet for one more day. She wanted to work her regular shift, to feel what it was like to serve tables one last time before stepping into her new role. Tomorrow morning, she would call a staff meeting and make the announcement. The drive to Bellamy's was the same as always, but everything looked different to Marissa now. The brick building with its elegant sign no longer represented just her workplace. It was her future, her legacy. "Morning, Marcus," she called to the chef as she entered through the back door. "You're looking happy today," he replied, eyeing her suspiciously. "Win the lottery or something?" Marissa just smiled. Or something. She changed into her uniform: black pants, white shirt, black vest, and the burgundy apron with the Bellamy's logo that all servers wore. Tomorrow, she wouldn't have to wear this uniform anymore, but today she wore it with a strange mix of pride and nostalgia. The morning prep went by quickly. Marissa helped polish glasses, fold napkins, and set tables. The restaurant manager, James, handed out section assignments. "Marissa, you got sections 3 and 4 today. We got the usual lunch crowd, plus that real estate group coming in at 1. They're big spenders, so make sure everything's perfect." She nodded, taking note of her sections, 10 tables that she knew like the back of her hand. Which ones wobbled slightly, which chairs needed a little extra cushioning, which spots got too much sun during the afternoon. As the lunch service began, Marissa moved through the dining room with practiced ease. She greeted regulars by name, remembered their usual orders, and made new customers feel welcome. Most people were kind, leaving good tips and thanking her for her service. But there were always the others. The ones who looked through her rather than at her. The ones who spoke slowly as if she might not understand basic English. The ones who seemed surprised when she could pronounce the French dishes on the menu perfectly. Marissa had learned to handle these customers with grace, never letting them see how their behavior affected her. 7 years in this industry had taught her patience and resilience. Little did she know that today would test those qualities like never before. As the clock hit 1:00 p.m., the real estate group James had mentioned walked through the door. 4 well-dressed white professionals led by a man whose expensive suit and confident stride screamed, "I'm in charge." Marissa approached their table with a professional smile. "Good afternoon. Welcome to Bellamy's. My name is Marissa, and I'll be taking care of you today." The man at the head of the table barely looked up at her as he replied, "We'll need a bottle of your best red wine to start." And so began what would become one of the most memorable days of Marissa Johnson's life. Marissa brought the wine bottle to the table with professional care. She presented it to the man at the head of the table, who she now knew was Richard Whitman, a well-known real estate developer in Charlotte. "The 2018 Cabernet Sauvignon, sir," she said, showing him the label. Richard barely glanced at it before waving his hand dismissively. "Fine, fine. Just pour it." Marissa kept her face neutral as she opened the bottle and poured a small amount for him to taste. Richard swirled it carelessly, took a quick sip, and nodded. She then poured for everyone at the table. "We're ready to order," Richard announced, though his colleagues were still looking at their menus. "Of course," Marissa replied with a polite smile. "What would you like today?" As she took their orders, Richard interrupted one of his colleagues, a younger woman who was asking about a fish dish. "Don't bother asking her about the food," Richard said loudly. "Just order something simple. I doubt she knows much about fine cuisine." The woman looked embarrassed, but remained silent. Marissa felt her cheeks warm, but kept her professional demeanor. "Actually, sir, I'd be happy to describe any of our dishes. The Chilean sea bass is prepared with a lemon herb crust and served with roasted seasonal vegetables. It's one of our most popular items." Richard rolled his eyes. "Just take the orders." The meal continued with Richard making little comments throughout. When Marissa brought their appetizers, he complained that the plates were too hot. When she refilled their water glasses, he asked if she could do it without hovering over them. At a nearby table, James, the restaurant manager, could hear what was happening. He caught Marissa's eye with a look that asked if she needed him to step in. She gave a small shake of her head. She had dealt with difficult customers before. Besides, tomorrow everything would change. The real trouble started when the main courses arrived. Marissa carefully placed each dish in front of the correct person, but when she set down Richard's steak, he frowned. "I ordered this medium rare," he said sharply. "Yes, sir, that's how it's prepared," Marissa replied. "This is clearly medium well," he insisted, cutting into the steak dramatically. The inside was pink, exactly as a medium rare steak should be. "I apologize if it's not to your liking," Marissa said. "I'd be happy to have the kitchen prepare another one for you." "No, I don't have time for that," Richard snapped. "Just bring me some extra sauce to cover up this mistake." When Marissa returned with the sauce, Richard was telling a story to the table, speaking loudly enough for nearby diners to hear. "This is why these fancy places should be more careful about who they hire," he was saying. "Some people just aren't cut out for this level of service." The others at the table looked uncomfortable. One man stared down at his plate, while another tried to change the subject. The woman glanced at Marissa with an apologetic expression. Marissa set down the sauce and asked, "Is there anything else I can get for you?" Richard looked her up and down. "Yes, actually, I'd like to speak to the owner." "Mr. Bellamy isn't here today," Marissa replied calmly. "Then get me whoever's in charge," Richard demanded. "I want to discuss the quality of service at this establishment." James had been watching and came over to the table. "Is there a problem, sir?" "Yes, there is," Richard said. "The service here has been disappointing. I've been coming to Bellamy's for years, and the standards are clearly slipping." James maintained his professional tone. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir. I can assure you that Marissa is one of our most experienced servers." "Well, experience clearly isn't everything," Richard replied with a smirk. "I want to speak to the owner about his hiring practices." James hesitated, then said, "I can call the owner for you, sir." "Do that," Richard said, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied expression. "I think Mr. Bellamy should know what's happening in his restaurant." As James walked away to make the call, Marissa continued serving the other tables in her section. Her hands were steady, but her heart was beating fast. The moment she had been waiting for had arrived sooner than expected. Little did Richard know that his demand to speak to the owner was about to change everything. James stepped into the quiet office at the back of Bellamy's and closed the door behind him. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to find Mr. Bellamy's number, still unaware of the ownership change that had happened that morning. As he was about to dial, there was a soft knock at the door. Marissa entered, her face composed but her eyes determined. "James, I need to tell you something." "Can it wait?" "I got to call Mr. Bellamy about that difficult customer," James said, his finger hovering over the call button. "That's exactly what I need to talk to you about," Marissa replied. She took a deep breath. "You don't need to call Mr. Bellamy. You can call the new owner instead." James looked confused. "New owner? What are you talking about? Mr. Bellamy didn't mention selling the restaurant." Marissa reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded document. She handed it to James, who opened it with a puzzled expression. His eyes widened as he read. "You bought Bellamy's?" he asked in disbelief. "When did this happen?" "The papers were signed this morning," Marissa explained. "I was going to tell everyone tomorrow at the staff meeting. Mr. Bellamy wanted a quiet exit, and I wanted one more day as a server before things changed." James sat down heavily in the office chair. "I had no idea you were even interested in buying the place." "I've been saving and planning for years," Marissa said. I have an MBA in hospitality management. This has always been my dream. For 7 years, Marissa had been putting aside money from every paycheck. She lived in a small apartment, drove an old car, and rarely took vacations. While other servers came and went, she stayed, learning every aspect of the restaurant business. At night, after long shifts on her feet, she would attend business classes. On her days off, she would study the restaurant's operations, taking mental notes on what worked and what could be improved. Mr. Bellamy had noticed her dedication and started mentoring her 3 years ago. "Remember all those extra shifts I took when Mr. Bellamy was out of town?" Marissa asked. "He was actually showing me the financial side of the business, teaching me about vendors, licensing, and all the behind-the-scenes details." 6 months ago, when Mr. Bellamy decided to retire, he had quietly offered Marissa the first chance to buy the restaurant. With her savings, a small business loan, and a bit of help from her mother who took out a second mortgage on her house, Marissa had managed to put together enough for the down payment. "So what do you want to do about that customer?" James asked, gesturing toward the dining room. Marissa's expression was calm but determined. "He asked to speak to the owner. I think it's time to introduce myself." "Are you sure?" "That guy is being a real jerk," James warned. "I'm sure," Marissa said. "But first, I need to change." James watched in amazement as Marissa removed her server's apron and vest. From her locker, she pulled out a crisp blazer that matched her black pants perfectly. She put it on, straightened her shoulders, and touched the small gold necklace her grandmother had given her for luck. "How do I look?" she asked. "Like an owner," James replied with a growing smile. Meanwhile, in the dining room, Richard was becoming impatient. He checked his expensive watch and complained to his colleagues. "How long does it take to make a phone call?" he grumbled. "This is exactly the kind of poor service I'm talking about." The others at the table looked increasingly uncomfortable. The woman, whose name was Sarah, spoke up. "Maybe we should just enjoy our meal, Richard. The food is excellent." "That's not the point," Richard insisted. "People need to know when they're not doing their jobs properly. That waitress clearly doesn't belong in a place like this." What Richard didn't know was that the waitress he had been treating so poorly was about to reveal herself as the very person he had demanded to speak with. As Marissa walked back through the kitchen, she passed Marcus, the chef. "What's with the fancy jacket?" he asked. "I'll explain everything later," she promised. "But right now, I need to handle something important." Marissa paused at the kitchen door, took a deep breath, and stepped into the dining room. Her first test as the new owner of Bellamy's was about to begin. Marissa walked confidently through the dining room, her blazer replacing the server's vest she had worn just minutes before. Several regular customers did double takes as she passed their tables. She heard a few whispers but kept her eyes focused on her destination, Richard Whitman's table. James followed a few steps behind her, trying to hide his smile. The other servers watched curiously, wondering what was happening. As Marissa approached the table, Richard was checking his watch again and sighing loudly. He didn't notice her at first, busy complaining to his colleagues. "This is ridiculous. How long does it take to reach the owner?" he said, stabbing at his steak. "Mr. Whitman," Marissa said clearly, standing tall at the head of the table. Richard looked up, confused to see the server he had been belittling now wearing a blazer instead of her uniform. "I understand you wanted to speak with the owner of Bellamy's," Marissa continued, her voice steady and professional. "Yes, finally," Richard said, not yet understanding. "Where is he?" Marissa smiled politely. "I'm afraid Mr. Bellamy is no longer the owner of this establishment." Richard frowned. "Well, who is then?" "I am," Marissa said simply. "My name is Marissa Johnson, and as of this morning, I am the new owner of Bellamy's restaurant." The table fell completely silent. Richard's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. His colleagues stared in shock. The woman, Sarah, covered her mouth with her hand. That's not possible," Richard finally managed to say. "I assure you it is," Marissa replied. She gestured to James. "My manager can confirm this." James nodded. "It's true. Ms. Johnson is now our boss." Richard's face turned a deep shade of red. He looked around the table at his colleagues, who were all avoiding his eyes. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice lower now. "You were just serving our table." Yes, I was, Marissa agreed. I've been a server here for 7 years. Today was meant to be my last day in that role before I announced the change to the staff tomorrow. But since you asked to speak to the owner about me, here I am. The younger man at the table let out a small, nervous laugh, quickly disguised as a cough when Richard glared at him. Now, Marissa continued, you had concerns about the service. I'd be happy to discuss them. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The other diners in nearby tables had gone quiet, listening to the exchange. I think there may have been a misunderstanding, Richard said stiffly. No misunderstanding, Mr. Whitman, Marissa said. You felt the service wasn't up to the standards you expect at Bellamy's. As the new owner, customer feedback is important to me. Sarah, seeing Richard struggle, tried to help. The service has been lovely, actually. And the food is wonderful. Thank you, Marissa said with a genuine smile. I'm glad to hear that. She turned back to Richard. Mr. Whitman, at Bellamy's, we believe in treating everyone with respect, our customers, our staff, and each other. That's a value I intend to uphold as the new owner. Richard loosened his tie slightly. The other diners had resumed their meals, but many were stealing glances at the table. I may have been too harsh in my criticism, Richard admitted reluctantly. I appreciate your honesty, Marissa replied. Now, can I get anyone dessert? It's on the house today. The table murmured their thanks, except for Richard, who remained silent, staring at his plate. As Marissa walked away to arrange their desserts, she heard Sarah saying to Richard, Did you really have to be so rude to her? In the kitchen, the staff gathered around Marissa, full of questions. Marcus, the chef, was the first to speak. So, boss, what just happened out there? Marissa smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Well, it seems our secret is out. Yes, I bought the restaurant from Mr. Bellamy. I was going to tell everyone tomorrow, but plans changed. The kitchen erupted in cheers and congratulations. In the middle of the celebration, James leaned in and asked quietly, Are you really comping their desserts after how he treated you? Marissa nodded. My grandmother always said, Kill them with kindness, but make sure they remember the lesson. I think Mr. Whitman just learned an important one. Back at the table, Richard Whitman sat in embarrassed silence as his business associates discussed what had just happened. The lesson was indeed being learned, and it was one Richard wouldn't soon forget. The dessert tray arrived at Richard's table, presented by James rather than Marissa. The selection looked delicious: creme brulee with fresh berries, chocolate lava cake, and house-made cheesecake. Richard's colleagues eagerly ordered their choices, the earlier tension giving way to excited chatter about the sweets. Richard himself remained quiet, picking at the remains of his steak. None for you, sir? James asked politely. No, thank you, Richard mumbled, not meeting the manager's eyes. As James walked away, Sarah leaned across the table. Richard, you need to properly apologize to her. I already said there was a misunderstanding, Richard replied defensively. The younger man at the table, David, shook his head. That wasn't an apology, Rich. You were way out of line. Look, how was I supposed to know she was the owner? Richard said, his voice low but defensive. That's not the point, Sarah countered. You shouldn't speak to anyone that way, owner or not. Richard's phone buzzed. He checked it and groaned. Great, just great. What is it? Asked the fourth person at the table, a man named Michael who had been mostly silent throughout the meal. Someone just posted about what happened here on social media, Richard said, showing them his phone. The post already has dozens of shares. They didn't use my name, but they mentioned a prominent real estate developer. Everyone will know it's me. The table fell silent again as they all processed this news. Meanwhile, Marissa was in her new office, Mr. Bellamy's old office, taking a moment to collect herself. The confrontation had gone better than she expected, but her heart was still racing. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called. Marcus, the chef, entered with a small plate. I made you something special to celebrate your first day as boss, he said, setting down a beautiful dessert. And also to help with the stress of dealing with jerks like that guy. Marissa laughed. Thank you, Marcus. So what happens now? He asked. With the staff, I mean. Nothing changes for now, Marissa assured him. I value everyone who works here. There will be some updates and improvements, but I'm not planning any major changes to our team. Marcus nodded, relieved. And what about that customer? Are you really letting him off the hook that easily? What would you have me do? Marissa asked. Throw him out? Make a scene? That's not the kind of place I want Bellamy's to be. I guess you're right, Marcus admitted. But if he ever comes back... If he ever comes back, Marissa said with a small smile, we'll serve him with the same respect and professionalism we show all our customers. That's who we are. Back in the dining room, Richard's group had finished their desserts. The bill came, with the desserts marked as complimentary, and Michael quickly grabbed it before Richard could reach for it. I got this one, Michael said firmly. As they prepared to leave, Richard noticed Marissa speaking with an elderly couple at another table. The couple were regulars, and they were clearly congratulating her on her new position. Marissa's face was bright with pride as she thanked them. Richard hesitated, then turned to his colleagues. You all go ahead. I'll meet you at the office. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What are you going to do? The right thing, finally, Richard replied. He waited until Marissa finished with the couple, then approached her cautiously. Several diners watched with interest, wondering if more drama would unfold. Ms. Johnson, Richard began, his voice quieter and more respectful than before. Could I have a minute of your time? Marissa looked surprised but nodded. Of course, Mr. Whitman. I wanted to apologize properly, he said. My behavior was inexcusable. I was rude, condescending, and prejudiced. There's no justification for how I treated you. Marissa studied his face, looking for sincerity. Thank you for saying that, Mr. Whitman. I understand if you prefer and not return to Bellamy's, Richard continued. That's not necessary, Marissa replied. All customers are welcome here, as long as they treat our staff with respect. Richard nodded, finally meeting her eyes. Congratulations on your achievement. Owning a restaurant like this is no small feat. Thank you, Marissa said simply. As Richard left Bellamy's, he knew his apology couldn't undo his actions. The story was already spreading through Charlotte's business community. Perhaps, he thought, this humbling experience would teach him to be better. For Marissa, this was just the beginning of her new journey as a restaurant owner. 2 weeks after the incident with Richard Whitman, Marissa stood in the middle of Bellamy's dining room early in the morning before opening. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the changes she had already begun to make. New artwork from local black artists hung on the walls, adding vibrant colors to the previously conventional decor. What do you think? She asked James, who was helping her arrange the new tables that had arrived yesterday. It feels fresher, he replied, stepping back to admire their work. More welcoming, but still elegant. That was exactly what Marissa had been aiming for. She wanted to maintain the upscale atmosphere that had made Bellamy successful, while making it more inclusive and representative of Charlotte's diverse community. The story of what happened with Richard had spread quickly through the city. At first, Marissa had been concerned about negative attention, but the opposite had occurred. Reservations had actually increased, with many people curious to meet the new owner who had handled such a difficult situation with grace. The new menus are here, Marcus called out, carrying a box from the delivery entrance. Want to see them? Marissa nodded eagerly. The menus were one of her first major changes. While keeping many of Bellamy's classic dishes, she had worked with Marcus to add new options that reflected her own heritage and the diverse culinary traditions of the South. She pulled one from the box and ran her fingers over the embossed logo. It was still Bellamy's, but beneath it now read, established 1985 *, renewed 2025. It was a small change that acknowledged both the restaurant's history and its new chapter. They look perfect, she said, smiling at the chef. The bell above the door jingled as someone entered. It was Sarah, the woman who had been at Richard's table that day. I'm sorry, we're not open yet, James began, but Marissa waved him off. It's okay. I recognized her, she said, walking over to greet Sarah. Good morning. How can I help you? Sarah looked a bit nervous. I wanted to come by when it wasn't busy. I'm Sarah Chen from Greenfield Partners. Of course, Marissa said. You were here for that memorable lunch. Sarah nodded. I wanted to apologize again for Richard's behavior, and also, I have a proposal for you. Intrigued, Marissa invited Sarah to sit at one of the newly arranged tables. Our company hosts a lot of business dinners, Sarah explained. We've been using various restaurants around the city, but I'd like to make Bellamy's our primary venue if you're interested. Marissa tried not to show her surprise. Greenfield Partners was one of the largest investment firms in Charlotte. Their business would be significant. May I ask why? Marissa asked carefully. Sarah smiled. Several reasons. The food is excellent. The atmosphere is perfect for business discussions. And frankly, after seeing how you handled that situation with Richard, I was impressed. The business world needs more people with that kind of poise and integrity. This was exactly the kind of opportunity Marissa had hoped for when buying Bellamy's, to create connections in the business community that went beyond just serving food. I'd be delighted to work with Greenfield Partners, Marissa said. Let me show you our new private dining room. We've renovated it specifically for business gatherings. As they walked through the restaurant, Marissa pointed out the changes she was making, not just to the decor, but to the entire approach. I'm implementing a new training program for all staff, she explained. Everyone, from dishwashers to servers, will learn about wine pairings, the details of our menu items, and advanced customer service techniques. I want everyone who works here to have the knowledge and confidence to provide excellent service. That's impressive, Sarah commented. Most restaurants don't invest that much in staff development. I was a server here for 7 years, Marissa reminded her. I know how it feels to be treated as just a waitress. In my restaurant, every position is respected and valued. By the time Sarah left, she had booked 3 corporate events and promised to return with colleagues for dinner the following week. As Marissa watched her go, a sense of satisfaction settled over her. Bellamy's was changing, growing into the vision she had carried for so long. The restaurant that had once been just her workplace was now becoming a reflection of her values and dreams. 3 months had passed since the day Richard Whitman had discovered that the waitress he had shamefully mistreated was actually the new owner of Bellamy's. During this time, Marissa had transformed the restaurant into one of the hottest dining spots in Charlotte. The local newspaper had featured her story, focusing on her journey from server to owner, and reservations were now booked weeks in advance. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, just before the dinner rush would begin, the front door of Bellamy's opened. Marissa, who happened to be checking the reservation list at the host's stand, looked up and froze. Richard Whitman was standing there alone, looking considerably more humble than the last time she had seen him. Good afternoon, Ms. Johnson, he said, his voice lacking the confidence he had displayed during their last encounter. Do you have a moment to talk? Marissa hesitated, then nodded. We can sit at the bar. We don't open for dinner for another hour. They moved to the bar area, which had been redesigned with warm wood tones and soft lighting. Richard seemed to notice the changes, looking around with appreciation. The place looks wonderful, he said. You've really made it your own. Thank you, Marissa replied, keeping her tone professional. What can I do for you, Mr. Whitman? Richard took a deep breath. I've been wanting to come back for a while now, but honestly, I was embarrassed. What happened that day? It changed things for me. Marissa raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. After that day, people looked at me differently, Richard explained. My colleagues, my friends, even my family heard about what happened. My daughter, who's in college, called me and said she was ashamed of my behavior. He paused, looking down at his hands. At first, I was angry. I felt like I was being unfairly judged for one bad day. But then I started thinking about how often I've spoken to service workers that way. Not just here, but everywhere. I started to realize it wasn't just one bad day, it was a pattern. Marissa's expression softened slightly. That's a difficult realization to have. It was, Richard agreed. I've spent these past months doing a lot of thinking. I even started seeing a therapist, if you can believe it. She's helping me understand where some of my prejudices come from. From behind the bar, James watched the conversation carefully, ready to intervene if Marissa needed support. But she seemed calm and in control. I appreciate you sharing that with me, Marissa said. It takes courage to face those kinds of truths about yourself. Richard nodded. I didn't come here expecting forgiveness or anything like that. I just wanted you to know that what happened that day had an impact, a positive one, eventually. Marissa considered this for a moment. Mr. Whitman, At Bellamy's, we believe everyone deserves a second chance. That includes difficult customers. A small smile appeared on Richard's face. Does that mean I can make a reservation for dinner sometime? You can, Marissa confirmed. But I should warn you that we have a strict policy about how our staff is treated. It applies to everyone, no matter who they are. I understand completely, Richard said. And I wouldn't want it any other way. As they stood up, Richard hesitated, then asked, "Can I ask you something personal, Ms. Johnson?" "You can ask," Marissa replied cautiously. "How did you do it? Buy this place, I mean. It must have been incredibly difficult." Marissa thought about the years of saving, the business classes, the loans, the sleepless nights worrying if she was making the right decision. "It was difficult," she admitted. "But I had a dream and a plan. And maybe more importantly, I had people who believed in me, even when others didn't see my potential." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Well, they were right to believe in you. What you've done here is remarkable." As Richard left, Marissa felt a sense of closure. The man who had once tried to humiliate her had returned a changed person. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about growth, for both of them. James approached her after Richard had gone. "Everything okay, boss?" Marissa smiled. "Yes, everything is exactly as it should be." 1 year after Marissa Johnson had taken ownership of Bellamy's restaurant, she stood at the entrance, greeting guests for a special anniversary celebration. The restaurant was filled with loyal customers, staff members, local business owners, and even the mayor of Charlotte had stopped by to offer congratulations. The past year had been challenging but incredibly rewarding. Bellamy's profits had increased by 30%, and they had been featured in several food magazines as one of the best dining experiences in the Southeast. Marissa had expanded the staff, added a small jazz band on weekend evenings, and created a mentorship program for young people interested in the restaurant business. "Ms. Johnson," called a familiar voice. Marissa turned to see Richard Wickman approaching with a small wrapped gift. "Congratulations on your first year." Their relationship had evolved over the months since his return. Richard had become a regular customer, always polite and respectful to every staff member. He had even brought important business clients to Bellamy's, introducing Marissa as the most impressive restaurant owner in Charlotte. "Thank you, Richard," she said, accepting the gift. "I'm glad you could make it tonight." "I wouldn't miss it," he replied. "May I?" He gestured to the small package. Marissa unwrapped it carefully to find a beautiful silver picture frame. Inside was a newspaper article from the day she had purchased Bellamy's, with a headline, "Local server becomes owner of Bellamy's restaurant." "I thought you might want to display this somewhere," Richard explained, "to remind everyone where you started and how far you've come." Marissa was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "This is perfect. Thank you." James appeared beside them with 2 glasses of champagne. "Boss, it's almost time for your speech." Marissa nodded, taking a glass. "I'll be right there." As James walked away, Richard said quietly, "There's something else I wanted to tell you. I'm starting a fund for minority business owners. It will provide low-interest loans and mentorship for people who want to start their own restaurants or shops, but don't have access to traditional funding." Marissa raised her eyebrows in surprise. "That's wonderful, Richard. What inspired this?" "You did," he admitted. "After what happened between us, I started thinking about all the talent and potential that gets overlooked because of prejudice. People like you shouldn't have to work twice as hard for the same opportunities." Before Marissa could respond, the sound of silverware tapping against glass filled the restaurant. The crowd was calling for her speech. "We'll talk more about this later," she promised, moving toward the center of the dining room. As she stood before her guests, Marissa felt a wave of pride and gratitude. She looked around at the faces of her staff, James, Marcus, and all the others who had supported her journey. She saw her mother wiping away tears of joy. She saw Sarah from Greenfield Partners, who had become both a valuable client and a friend. "A year ago today," Marissa began, "I officially became the owner of Bellamy's restaurant. Some of you know that my journey here began 7 years earlier when I started as a server. Others of you," she smiled slightly in Richard's direction, "discovered my new role in a more dramatic fashion." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the crowd. "This past year has taught me that sometimes difficult moments can lead to unexpected opportunities. They can force us to grow, to change, and to see each other more clearly. She raised her glass. I want to thank everyone who has been part of this journey, my incredible staff who bring their best to work every day, our loyal customers who have embraced the changes we've made while honoring the traditions that make Bellamy special, and to those who doubted me along the way, thank you for giving me something to prove. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Later that evening, as the celebration continued, Marissa stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The neon Bellamy sign glowed softly above her. She remembered her grandmother's words. "Baby girl, you're going to own something special one day." She had been right, but Bellamy's had become more than just a successful restaurant. It had become a place of transformation for Marissa, for her staff, for Richard, and for the community. What had started with an uncomfortable confrontation had grown into something beautiful and meaningful. As Marissa looked up at the stars, she smiled. This was just the beginning.